Hi, Paul Thomson here from Spitfire Audio. I'm very excited today to be showing you Grand Brass. It's the latest selection from our Abbey Road One film scoring selections. Focusing on four horns in combination with a tuba an octave down, but also there's a couple of patches with the four horns in combination with cello. As ever, these do specific idiomatic things incredibly well. These patches have been designed to give you not only the kind of lyrical feel of the brass in combination, but also the punchy brass-only sound for the short notes as well. Let's dive in. I've written a short piece of music which I'm going to play to you once I've shown you the individual articulations in the collection, and then we can have a look at that piece and you can see how I'm using it in context and how you might use it in your compositions. So as you can hear, a really lovely agile staccato that goes from beautiful soft notes all the way up to these really lovely punchy heavy tones. Now with the UI you can see that you've got the octave symbol below, and that tells you that this patch has the horns and the tuba playing in octave. So the horns are all on the top note and then the tuba plays an octave below. Now this not only matches the sounds timbrally much better, but it also gives you access to that very, very common orchestration device, pre-recorded and ready to go. Let's have a look at the legato. So the rich grand sound of those four horns and the tuba. And it's really lovely because in the passages between the notes, as you hear the legato transitions play, you get the very characteristic sound of the tuba changing notes where the pistons change so the airflow stops and then restarts. But you also get that lovely kind of elision between the notes in the horns. And we can hear that very clearly if we go away from our kind of standard mix and put up just the close mics. But let's stick to our main mix for now, and let's have a listen to the long notes. Now, as you can hear, this is really useful for playing these really solid sounds. Maybe when you want to sound loud, I would go for a more open sound, so I might play octaves, which gives you a range of 3 octaves within this patch, which is really, really useful. But also, you can use it for the kind of choral sound of the brass playing very quietly. And that sounds like this. Just this fantastic, grand, stately sound. Whichever end of the dynamic range you want to go for, you're still getting that beautiful, characteristic texture. So we heard our staccato, nice and kind of bitey and punchy. We've also got this more leisurely tenuto. And finally, we've got 3 incredibly useful swells. Which give you access to some different variations of this incredibly useful sound. It's always great to bring the low brass swelling into an impact point. Really, really great characteristic effect there. Now, before we move on, I just want to go back to these mixes just to give you a very quick feel for the different sounds. So let's flick through them quickly. So here with Mix 2, you've got a slightly more intense and wider sound. We've got these two fabulous vintage signals using all of the great gear that Abbey Road has at its disposal. We've got these two really great pop signals. So first the close for when you want the sound really to punch right into your face. And then a corresponding pop room signal to give you the ability to dial up the sound of the room behind that punchy sound. We have our familiar CTAO, so you've got a close mic with a traditional kind of orchestral spacing. And those would typically be used to add a kind of bite to the sound. And you've got two different tree options, one of which is slightly more directional and one of which is slightly more omni, but you can hear the difference here. You've got the most ambient mics, the most distant ones. The outriggers, which are really useful for dialing in an extra width to the tree. And finally, the spill mix, which is all of the other orchestra mics that you can add in to get a nice extra kind of 3D space to the sound. So what about these last two articulations, the soaring legato and the soaring longs? Well, we wanted to give you an alternative to the main legato with the tuba of that very beautiful, stately, grand sound, and something that was expressed the more lyrical side of the horns. And quite commonly, this is orchestrated to take the cellos along for the ride. Check this out. And of course, the longs for this are just incredibly useful on their own. So it's a really incredibly useful alternative to the main legato in the grand brass patch. It still accomplishes a lot of the same kind of feel for the thing. It's got that kind of lyricism, it's got that kind of stateliness and that beauty and that grandness about it. But it has a slightly more passionate intensity that comes from the cellos with their vibrato and their kind of singing throat range. Now, let us look at this piece which I've written to demonstrate just very quickly how you might use these sounds in context. Now I'm going to set this up by just saying that anything that you can see that is brass, which is red, is coming from this selection. And as you can see, I'm using all of the Abbey Road percussion in here. And then strings wise, I've really only used two very specific colours halfway through from the Orchestral Foundations package of Abbey Road One, because I wanted you to be able to clearly hear that when you are hearing those cellos, you're hearing them from the alternative legato, the soaring legato or longs that are in this selection grand brass package. Okay, let's have a listen from the top to the bottom, and then I'll just pick out a couple of the things in there that I'm doing and explain my thinking behind them. Okay, so the first thing which I'd like to show you is just the strings that you can hear that are not the soaring long. I think it's fairly clear visually, but let's just isolate those very quickly so that you can hear them clearly. So in that middle section, we've got those high trems. And that's it. So that is all the string sound that you hear that's not from this selection. That's it. And really, I just wanted a higher colour there just to put in. I didn't want to do a kind of whole big orchestration on this because I wanted it to be really, really clear and easily heard what sections I'm using. Now, the other elements are, of course, the woodwinds. So what am I using here? I've got a little bit of this high ensemble here, which sounds like this. Really lovely. And then, of course, we've got the melodic element. And the sparkling legato, the woodwind legato comes in at the end. So as you'll probably remember from the sparkling legato walkthrough, that woodwind package has the octaves built in, the orchestration, but it also has the Glock that you can switch on and off. So that's amazingly useful as well, and I wanted to use that for its colour there. What else have we got? Well, of course, the soft boom, which I absolutely adore from Abbey Road One. Which is helping me to accent those. It's giving me an extra kind of grandness to proceedings to have that kind of, solid kind of boom. Even though it's very, very soft, it just gives you a kind of pulse to the whole thing. So that's really useful. I'm using the timpani and I'm playing them pretty much as you would play an actual timpani, and I'm doing a little bit of a roll crescendo. I'll just play that on its own. It sounds like this. So that gives me, a nice kind of, it's not too precise, if you know what I mean. It kind of gives you just that feeling that you can hear someone just gently rolling away in the background, but it doesn't have the kind of traditional thing that you imagine with a timpani roll where you go, brrr. I didn't want to have that. I just wanted this kind of, very slightly uneven feel where it's just kind of doing something really gentle. If I actually solo the percussion stacks, then you can hear the context of it, maybe as we get towards this last one here. And all of these things I'm using really low dynamics, when the bass drum and snare come in here as well. So you can see that what I'm doing is I'm using the low dynamics just to add a little bit of background color to give a little bit of the feeling of the pulse of the music, and just to fill out the sound with a kind of lovely rich underbelly. Pretty much all of these things I've either just played them in live and left them, or I may just pull them a little bit towards the beat. So for example here you can see that I've got a quantize on for an eighth note with that, but only a 78% strength. So it's not really bang on. If we zoomed into this, it's around the beat, but it's kind of, it was just a little bit too loose. And that's always something that I think about when I'm running with, when I've started to put plugins onto a track. I'll talk about that in a second as well. There's not a huge amount on this, but once I've started to add plugins and then I'm going back and adding more instruments, it's always a bit of a kind of balance between, okay, you're going to have a bit more latency, so it's slightly harder to play precisely in time, but you also want the feel of the natural playing. And you can always use low latency mode up here in Logic, and that kind of brings the latency back down again by cutting some of the plugins out of the chain. But while there are lots of ways around it, sometimes the best way to just pull a part in that you're playing and it's a little bit too out of time is just to have that quantize on. But I rarely go for 100% unless it's a very, very specific effect, or if I'm programming something that is like hugely hybrid sounding or has to be really, really rigid, like dance track or something like that. So what else have we got going on? Well, we've got the piccolo snare comes in later on, and the toms again alongside. So let's just play that section. And again, things are starting to sing out a bit more for this section because it's a little bit more kind of, I hesitate to say action. It's very grand and stately action if it is. But what you've got is that lovely kind of, again, the richness. And another thing which I learned from Hans Zimmer is that the harder you hit drums, the tighter the sound becomes, and the less the less of the low frequency range you get from the drum, and it really kind of chokes at a certain point. Now that can be great, that can be a fantastic sound, but hearing what he was doing with at the very beginning of the Dark Knight series, for example, of recording these drums very, very softly and then cranking up the volume so that you get that kind of enormous earth-shattering boom, is just, I always think about that when I'm programming parts, and I always remember, okay, if I'm going to go too high up the dynamic range, the drums are going to start to tighten up. So I'm going to lose some of that resonance down in the bottom end. Now, the other thing that I've done here in the percussion section is I've varied the sound that I'm using for that kind of low end. I'm using the soft boom at the beginning. As the piece starts to develop, I get switched to the traditional bass drum sound, which sounds like this. So that the soft boom is much more of a kind of super low frequency thing. And then I'm using the Verdi drums at the end, which again, it's kind of halfway between the two. It has the size and the kind of width and spread, but it does have an articulation of a slightly higher or sort of mid to high frequency in there as well. Apart from that, a bit of tam-tam and piatti, but again, I'm generally using them at a kind of low level so that they're just kind of, they have that lovely, when you strike the piatti or the tam-tam at a low dynamic, physically, I mean, when you physically strike the actual things, they do have a lovely kind of bloom on them. They don't come instantly in with a kind of massive crack at the head. So that's incredibly useful as well, to use that to also help give the kind of spread and the width and the 3D sound of the track. So the last thing that I wanted to show you was just how I use the staccatos and tenutos together. And rather than key switching this, which is completely possible, and obviously you have the trigger section over here with all kinds of things that you can use, instead of key switching, if key switching is not your thing. But instead of using those kind of things, I've put them on 2 tracks so that it's really, really easy to see exactly what's going on in this section. So I'm going to zoom in, and then I'm going to play just those on their own. So you get the idea. It's really, really simple, but it just adds such an extra amount of musicality to just have those different lengths and to switch between them for the notes that you want to accent. So, the alternative way of doing that would be to just accent them with dynamic, but somehow this sounds nicer, sounds a bit more interesting. So the final thing to do is to look at the mix page, so I can just show you briefly what's going on here. So I have a few instances of cinematic rooms. If I just switch to all here, you can see I've got a couple of things set up, but actually the only ones that I'm using here is a little bit of the Amethyst Hall on cinematic rooms. I don't see anything else. There's no EQs or anything like that. Let's just go back to tracks. Yeah, just a bit of reverb on things to glue the whole thing together. And then at the final hurdle, as it were, at the kind of mix channel, I've put a little bit of precision case stereo just to add a tiny bit of width. It's got that teeny hair at 0.5 dB. It's just a sound that I like. I've got some outboard on here. That's a very simple signal chain. It's an API 5500 EQ with 2 dB at the bottom and at the top. So just a very gentle smiley face to give me that kind of cinematic sound. And also I'm using my SSL compressor, but it's not really compressing very much. It only kicks in at the loud section when I do the big swell in the middle, and apart from that it's just sat there, so that's not adding a huge amount. And then finally at the very end I've got the L2, and all that is really kind of it's bringing the overall level up slightly, but it's also just keeping an eye on the outs to make sure that I don't clip anything at the end there. And in fact, let me show you what it sounds like without any of that stuff. So if I play, where should we go from here? So if we turn all of that off and have a listen again. So as you can see, not adding a huge amount. There's obviously a bit of a gain change when I switch the I/O back in, which is giving you it's a little bit of the smiley face, but it's also a bit of the compressor gain staging where I'm just bringing the levels up a little bit before it gets back into Logic. So that's Grand Brass, our latest selection of the Abbey Road One film scoring selections. I hope that some of that was interesting and useful. Maybe there's a few ideas in there you can take away to your own compositions. I'm really looking forward to seeing how people use this, not only on its own in their compositions, but also in the context of with other brass libraries. Obviously, I haven't done that here because I want you to clearly be able to hear what sounds are in the library. And actually, I would use this in combination with our other brass libraries. But this, as with all of our selections, fills an incredibly useful slot. It's designed and specifically recorded, and the specific techniques that we use to capture it are designed to accomplish that thing incredibly well and to get that authentic sound, which is sometimes quite hard to get. So thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye-bye.